Hello, and welcome to Democracy When, where everything is made up and the facts don't matter. In this inaugural episode of Democracy When, we're going to be giving a lay of the land of Democracy Now! In it, we'll be introducing the hosts and the recurring cast of characters. We're also going to be introducing some key events that foreshadow the discussion to come, which will involve the shift in ideology, purpose, and function of the program over the last decade. Stay with us, we're going in. For those who don't know, Democracy Now! Is an independent, American left-wing television, radio, and internet news program that is hosted by Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez. The program has been running in one form or another since 1996, first getting its start on Pacifica Radio, a radio station founded by pacifists E. John Lewis and Lewis Hill in 1946. Pacifica first shot, or rather exploded onto the public consciousness when the KKK bombed the radio station's transmitter. Undeterred, they sallied forth, and have been a fertile ground for independent media ever since. Democracy Now!'s program combines investigative reporting, interviews, and news commentary from a decidedly left-wing perspective, wherein it documents political movements, social justice struggles, and the effects of American foreign policy. The show has been described as progressive for both fans and critics alike. However, Amy Goodman rejects this label, and in an interview with Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, described the program thusly.
And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether they're a Palestinian child or an Israeli mother, whether they're an Iraqi uncle or a Venezuelan aunt or a kid from the South Bronx, you say, it sounds like my baba, it sounds like my abba, it sounds like my abu, it sounds like my ima or my whatever language you speak. It breaks down barriers.
That said, Democracy Now!'s website describes its staff as some of the most progressive reporters and journalists from around the country. Among them are indeed Amy Goodman and Juan Gonzalez, who both have extensive investigative journalism careers that stretch back decades, with Goodman providing some incisive work into the East Timor genocide and independence movement, as well as Chevron's role in transporting and supporting the Nigerian military troops to fight against its own people who were protesting against ground and water contamination from oil extraction. Gonzalez has worked extensively with Hispanic organizations to increase the representation of Hispanic journalists, and has also provided some extensive reporting on the adverse health effects caused by air pollution from 9/11, as well as how public officials misled New Yorkers about the real dangers of toxic contamination after the attacks. Over the decades, Democracy Now! Has hosted a number of controversial thinkers to come onto the show and debate or opine on hot-button topics that are often neglected by the mainstream media. The recurring casts of guests, however, tend to be from a left to far left perspective, often finding themselves on the bottom or even top left quadrant of the political spectrum. These folks include Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, Chris Hedges, Glenn Greenwald, Michael Moore, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and Slavoj Žižek for some reason. Now, I've been listening to this show since about 2008, and though I still find elements of it to be admirable and respectable, such as their debates and investigative journalism, I cannot help but think that the show is changing, and is changing for the worst. Philosophically, the change that has occurred in Democracy Now!, I think, is in lockstep with many of the changes that are plaguing the so-called left today. There's the insistence on identity politics, the demonization of white and working class people, but particularly men, the angelification of the other, be it black men, Muslims, or immigrants, and an increasing presence of the academic intelligentsia that has shifted the discourse from encompassing material concerns to the so-called intersectional concerns that really do blur the line between social criticism and narcissism. Programmatically, Democracy Now! Used to be an independent news program that focused on the needs and concerns of the working class people both at home and abroad. These were the issues that tend to be neglected by the mainstream media. However, Democracy Now! Then became a program where people spoke their minds on a variety of social issues and more. And now, I think it's become something else. I think it has become a voice for the voiceless. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing, giving people a voice. And it isn't a bad thing to give voices to people and events that are often neglected by the larger news media companies. However, when the voiceless get to speak their minds and predominate the discussion, I think that we're actually getting a narrower range of acceptable ideas. It is also important to note how Democracy Now! Restricts the range of acceptable opinions on its show. For instance, as previously stated, Democracy Now! Will often host left-wing guests. However, whenever a right-wing guest is on the show, they are always accompanied by a left-wing guest to rebut them. This is ironic because this is exactly one of the criticisms Chomsky himself had about the mainstream media. To quote Noam Chomsky, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. even encourage the more critical and dissonant views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. This is certainly true for the mainstream media. And when the mainstream media attempts to uphold the status quo, it goes wherever the money is. And wherever the mainstream media is going, Democracy Now! Can be seen going in the opposite direction. This doesn't mean that since Democracy Now! Isn't a part of the system, that it is immune from this biased behavior. In fact, I think Democracy Now! Has taken on some of the worst characteristics of its enemies and just expresses those characteristics in a other side of the coin type fashion. Where the mainstream media goes with the status quo, Democracy Now! Has gone intersectional, and when one goes intersectional, it is very hard to keep things straight. There are numerous examples of how Democracy Now!'s intersectionality has led them down some confusing paths, without a clear mission, goal, or conclusion to draw from, and that the platform that they have provided for people to speak their minds has turned cacophonous. Just to get us started, here are 3 examples. During the 2016 election, Democracy Now! Repeatedly warned of Trump's inchoate fascist tendencies, as well as his apparent Islamophobia, and insisted that he is indeed like Hitler. And yet, they also featured a representative for Muslim women who support Trump to discuss their views. Now, what are we to glean from this? Are we to soften our view on Trump because some Muslim women support him despite his foibles and think that he isn't as bad as Democracy Now! Has been previously telling us? Or are we to think that the Muslim women who support Trump are a part of the problem and that they support Trump because they're right-wing authoritarians themselves? After all, the Muslim woman was, and probably still is, a Republican. And I don't know, I guess it's complicated. Another example that requires connecting a few dots and being a regular listener of the program for a few years is probably one of the most egregious. When the Boston bombing occurred and the subsequent manhunt for the Tsarnaev brothers was underway, they, Democracy Now!, alongside their guest Glenn Greenwald, stated that we should be wary about calling this an act of terrorism, stating,
question. The assumption seems to be that this is terrorism. Everybody is running around calling these 2 brothers terrorists, aside from the fact that it assumes their guilt, which we shouldn't be doing. We know almost nothing about what it is that motivated them to go and do what they did. When non-Muslims commit horrific crimes, whether it's shooting far more people and killing them in Aurora in a movie theater, or elementary school children in Sandy Hook, or 8 people in Tucson, Arizona, where Gabrielle Giffords was shot. Quickly, as soon as we find out they're not Muslim, the idea is, well, this isn't terrorism. This is just people snapping, becoming mentally ill. The only thing that we really know about these 2 brothers in terms of what might have motivated them is that they identify as Muslim, and at least the older brother seems to have been associated with Islam, although the younger brother doesn't really seem to have. And yet there's this assumption, and that's the whole debate, is that this is nonetheless an act of terrorism. There's no indication that they have any association of any kind with designated terrorist organizations, any contact with those organizations, no indication that radical political or religious beliefs in any way motivated them to do what they did. It's possible that that's the case, but it's possible it didn't. And yet the rush to declare this terrorism, I think, reflects the reality that all terrorism really means, politically, culturally, and even legally, is it's a special category of crime committed by Muslims that result in a whole deprivation of all kinds of rights and protections that is reflected in the current debate. And that is what I think is the most dangerous and enduring aspect of this entire last week.
Though it was hard not to state all that is wrong with the series of comments made by Greenwald, I do agree that the curtailment of civil rights under governmental imperatives for security are dangerous and ought to be challenged. And I suppose others would disagree for different reasons, because when Charlottesville and the death of Heather Heyer occurred, Democracy Now!'s guests stated that it was an obvious act of white supremacist terrorism.
This whole question about, is it terror? Is it not terror? That is a question that should no longer be asked. It absolutely is terrorism. By every definition, not only are these acts of violence that are intended to cause terror, but they are also politically informed. It is people using terrorism as a tactic to push an ideology. There is absolutely no moral difference between a white supremacist plowing his car into a crowd of unarmed protesters to advance an ideology, and someone who was inspired by ISIS plowing their car into a crowd on a street in Germany for the same reasons, to drive home some ideology that they believe in. There's no difference. It is terrorism. It should be labeled as such. It should be dealt with as such. It should be investigated as such. Not only should, people like Dylan Roof and the terrorist from Saturday be charged and prosecuted, but there needs to be an investigation of these networks. How far do they go? How far into the power structure do they reach?
I cannot help but see the glaring inconsistency here. The erosion of civil rights by government efforts to tackle terrorism, quote-unquote, are just as real when a Muslim extremist does it as when a white supremacist does it. One final example is a little more comedic, and it involves Michael Moore, who, on the same program with Democracy Now!, will say simultaneously that fascism won't come to America with concentration camps and jackboots, but with a TV show and a smile.
One of the inspirations to make this film was a book I'd read back in the 1980s by Bertram Gross called Friendly Fascism. And in the book, Gross says that the fascism of the 21st century will not come with concentration camps and swastikas. It will come with a smiley face and a TV show.
However, in the same interview, he will argue that Trump is a fascist, and the evidence that we have for that claim are the concentration camps for illegal immigrants at the border. But if fascism in the U.S. won't come with concentration camps, then the concentration camps that we see shouldn't be evidence of fascism coming to the U.S. So what is it, Michael? Explain that to me. Overall, I think Democracy Now! Has become an overreaction to a legitimate series of problems. In some cases, they do get the facts straight and perform some great journalism. However, they also come across as myopic and cynical at times, with all the problems stemming from the American empire, or white supremacy, or capitalism, or patriarchy. I will delve into these issues, among others, in greater depth in upcoming videos, and will dissect the inconsistencies within them. The issues of terrorism, justice, vengeance, virtue, identity politics, and others crop up time and time again, and I plan on demonstrating Democracy Now!'s inconsistencies. This is why I stated at the outset that everything is made up and facts don't matter. It is because the purpose of the show is to be a voice for the voiceless, to allow people to speak their minds, to speak their truth. However, one's spoken truth is not necessarily the truth of the matter. Lived experience isn't warrant. Suffering isn't warrant. Argumentatum ad misericordiam isn't warrant. It is a fallacy. There's a book I had read in my university years called Towards a Political Philosophy of Race, and it was written by sociologist Falguni Sheth, who coincidentally also shared a panel with Glenn Greenwald to talk about security post 9/11 America. In it, she offers a critique of liberalism and its legal apparatus, and she attempts to take down its pretensions to individual freedom and justice. It goes something like this. The law isn't a neutral thing. The law can be conceived of as a blade that cuts according to the inclination of the sovereign. Now, it certainly waxes poetic, it waxes Foucauldian, and Democracy Now! Has never said this, but it got my noggin jogging. Why would someone say this? Would one think that one would never wield the blade? That one is so impotent and weak as to never have the power to do so, and therefore the only recourse that they have is to ridicule and degenerate the sovereign and power? Is this an example of their own resentment and their own weakness and their own hatred of the powerful? Or is it possibly a warning of something to come? Thank you for listening, and stay tuned, because we're about to perpetuate philosophy with a knife.